The crowd outside the Bennett stage house had gathered thick enough that Clara Bennett could no longer see the porch steps her father had built with his own hands. Victor Shaw stood atop a wooden crate reading the final terms of the sale in a voice pitched for everyone to hear. Clara's fingers tightened around the brass key in her pocket, the same key her father had pressed into her palm the day he taught her to lock the stage house door herself. Samuel stood pressed against her side, 10 years old and trying hard not to let his chin tremble in front of the whole gathered valley. "Do I hear any further bids?" Victor called out, already smiling at his own certainty, already reaching for the gavel a clerk had handed him. Going once to the only bidder present. A dusty man walked through the crowd without hurrying, his hat low, his boots worn thin at the heels, the kind of cowboy nobody in Sagebrush Valley troubled themselves to notice twice. Elias Rourke stopped at the edge of the crate and looked up at Victor with an expression that carried no anger at all, only a terrible kind of calm. Victor laughed, sharp and dismissive, the laugh of a man who had never once been interrupted by someone beneath his notice. "This is a legal sale, cowboy. A hired hand has no standing here. Might want to check whose name sits on that deed before you swing that gavel," Elias said, his voice even and unhurried, "because the property you're fixing to sell isn't yours to sell at all." The crowd went still in the particular way a crowd goes still when it senses something true has just been said aloud. Clara stared at the dusty stranger who had, with a single quiet sentence, stopped an auction that half the county believed already finished. She did not yet understand what kind of man could do that with nothing more than his own voice. To understand how they had arrived at that frozen, breathless moment, it helps to go back 5 weeks, to the ordinary afternoon Elias Rourke first walked up the stagehouse road. Clara Bennett had run the Bennett stagehouse alone for 3 years, since her husband's fever took him and left her the building, the debts, and her late brother's son to raise together. She kept the ledgers herself, cooked for every driver who came through, and mended the roof with her own 2 hands whenever the money for a proper carpenter simply wasn't there. Her father, Josiah Bennett, had built the stagehouse from nothing and had died still owing money on it to a bank that had since, without much explanation, transferred the note to a company Clara had never heard of before that spring. Victor Shaw had arrived with the paperwork and a smile a month later, calling himself a land representative preparing the valley for a railroad spur that would, he assured her, make everyone considerably wealthier if they simply cooperated with his office in the meantime. Clara had inherited the stagehouse at 29, 3 years widowed by then, and had spent those years learning trades she'd never expected to need, roofing and account keeping and the particular diplomacy required to manage tired freight drivers who arrived hungry and left grateful. She had raised Samuel alongside all of it, her brother's boy since her brother and his wife had perished together in a river crossing accident when the child was barely 6, and she had never once let the boy see how frightened those early lonely months had actually made her. The mortgage he claimed to hold said Clara owed the full balance within 60 days, a demand so far outside the original terms her father had signed that she had written 3 separate letters asking for the original documents, none of which Victor had ever produced. Samuel had taken to watching the road each afternoon, the particular vigilance of a boy who understood, without being told outright, that something important might be taken from him. It was into this uneasy spring that Elias Rourke walked, dusty from a long ride, asking only for a meal and offering a day's honest work in trade for it. Clara looked him over the practical way she looked over every stranger who came through her door, judged him harmless and probably broke, and told him the woodpile out back could use splitting before supper. He split that whole woodpile without complaint, then noticed the sagging porch step nobody had gotten around to fixing and repaired that too, without being asked a second time. Clara watched him from the kitchen window and thought, plainly, that here was a man who worked the way her father used to work, quiet and thorough and entirely unbothered by being unnoticed. She did not think, that first evening, to wonder why a supposedly penniless drifter carried himself with such unhurried certainty. She only thought that Samuel had laughed twice at supper for the first time in a month, watching the stranger demonstrate exactly how to properly whittle a slingshot handle. Elias stayed on through the following days, taking small jobs around the stagehouse and the neighboring spreads, never asking for more than his meals and a place in the barn loft to sleep. Clara noticed, without quite naming it to herself, how easily the freight drivers who stopped through seemed to defer to him, falling quiet when he spoke, taking his advice about weather and road conditions without argument. He rose before dawn most mornings without being asked, checking the stagehouse's own team of horses alongside whatever work he'd taken on for the day, and Clara found herself, more than once, watching him from the kitchen window with a curiosity she did not fully examine. He ate simply, never complained about the plain fare she offered, and thanked her each time with a sincerity that felt entirely unpracticed, the particular gratitude of a man unaccustomed to being served rather than serving. She noticed, too, the particular way old Otis Bragg, foreman on the Larkin spread 2 miles over, had started to address him as Mr. before catching himself and calling him simply Rourke instead, the way a man corrects a slip of the tongue too late to fully hide it. She filed the small oddities away without much urgency, the way a person files away details that do not yet demand an explanation. It was the water route that first genuinely puzzled her. Elias walked the dry creek boundary one morning with a directness that suggested he had walked it 100 times before, naming the exact spot where the old bridge had washed out 3 winters back and been rebuilt with lumber donated, he said, by a rancher who understood the whole valley depended on that crossing staying open. "You've been through here before," Clara said, watching him crouch to examine the creek bank. "More than passing through, I'd wager." "Knew the man who built that bridge," Elias said, and offered nothing further, the particular closed expression of someone deciding, in real time, how much truth a question actually deserved. Clara let the matter drop, though she found herself turning it over more than once in the days that followed. Victor Shaw's visits grew more frequent as the 60 days shortened toward 30, each one carrying a fresh urgency dressed up as friendly concern. He suggested, gently and repeatedly, that a widow alone might find the burden considerably lighter if she simply signed the transfer papers and let his company manage the property honestly on her behalf. Clara refused each time with the same steady politeness, understanding that whatever Victor's papers claimed, something about the whole arrangement did not sit right with the careful records she had kept of her father's original agreement. She began, quietly, going back through years of guest ledgers and freight schedules, the particular stubborn instinct of a woman who trusted her own careful accounting over any stranger's confident paperwork. Victor's visits grew increasingly pointed as the weeks wore on, his friendly concern hardening by careful degrees into something closer to open pressure. He mentioned, more than once, that a widow running a struggling stagehouse alone might find herself the subject of unkind talk in town, the particular veiled threat of a man accustomed to bending people through implication rather than open confrontation. Clara met each implication with the same level composure she brought to every difficult freight driver or nervous guest, refusing to let him see how much the mounting pressure actually cost her some nights, alone at her ledgers long after Samuel had gone to bed. She kept her fear carefully separate from her daily bearing, understanding that a woman who showed weakness to a man like Victor Shaw only invited him to press harder. Elias, in those same weeks, became something closer to a fixture around the stagehouse than either of them had planned for. He fixed the leaking section of roof over the kitchen during a hard spring rain, working in the downpour without complaint until the leak stopped entirely. Clara brought him dry clothes afterward, and found herself, without quite deciding to, sitting across the kitchen table longer than the errand required, listening to him talk plainly about cattle and weather and the particular stubbornness of Wyoming soil. She noticed the old injury in his shoulder that made him favor his left arm on cold mornings, and began, without remarking on it, leaving liniment where he'd find it convenient rather than offered outright. He never mentioned the shoulder directly, though she noticed one evening that he used the liniment without comment and returned the jar to its exact spot on the shelf the following morning. It became, in its small way, a language between them that required no explanation, the particular understanding 2 careful people build when neither wishes to make more of a kindness than the kindness itself requires. He helped Samuel rebuild a model freight wagon the boy had broken, patient through 3 failed attempts before the wheels finally turned true, and Samuel began following him around the property with the particular devotion boys reserve for men who explain things without talking down to them. Clara watched the two of them together more than once, with an ache in her chest she recognized, uneasily, as something she had not let herself feel since her husband's death. Samuel asked him once, with a child's plain directness, whether he had ever had a father who taught him things the way he was teaching Samuel now. Elias had answered carefully, saying only that his own father had died young, and that whatever he knew of patience he'd mostly learned from watching an older brother who had since passed as well, a brother he did not yet explain further. A stranded freight driver named Amos Kellerman broke an axle on the road below the stagehouse one afternoon, and Elias worked alongside him for 3 hours in the heat, fixing what a lesser man might have simply abandoned to the next morning's help. Amos thanked him afterward with a particular gratitude that went beyond ordinary courtesy, the gratitude of a man who understood exactly how much that afternoon's help had likely saved him. Clara asked Amos, later, how long he'd known Elias, and Amos had gone oddly careful in his answer, saying only that a man in his line of work came to know a great many people along this road, and left it at that. She noted the evasion the way she noted most things worth noting, filed away for later consideration. "You disagree with Charity," Elias observed one evening, watching her refuse, for the third time, his offer to simply pay off a portion of what Victor claimed she owed. "I don't take money I haven't earned," Clara said plainly. "Not charity if it's freely given between people who respect each other," Elias said. "It's charity if it changes what I owe you," Clara answered, and something in her voice closed the subject firmly enough that he did not raise it again. He respected the boundary without resentment, which told her more about his character than almost anything else he might have said. She found herself trusting him more for the refusal he accepted gracefully than for any gift he might have pressed on her instead. It was Mr. Dabney, the bank's local representative, who first cracked the careful composure Clara had come to associate with Elias entirely. Dabney had come to discuss the transferred mortgage, and Elias, standing nearby mending a bridle, asked one quiet question about which office in Cheyenne had actually authorized the transfer. Dabney's face went pale in a way Clara had never seen a banker's face go pale, and he mumbled something about needing to check his records before excusing himself rather abruptly. Clara looked at Elias, who had already gone back to mending the bridle as though nothing remarkable had happened at all. "What did you ask him," she said, "that made him look like that?" "Asked him something he didn't have a good answer for," Elias said, and would not be drawn further despite her pressing. She began, that same evening, to wonder in earnest exactly what kind of drifting cowhand knew enough about mortgage transfers and territorial banking offices to unsettle a professional banker with a single question. She did not yet have the courage, or perhaps simply the readiness, to ask him outright. The creek boundary proved the thread that finally pulled the whole knot loose. Clara had been comparing Victor's transfer papers against her father's original survey for weeks, and one evening, cross-referencing the described boundary against her own careful records of every dry season road closure for the past decade, she found the discrepancy. Victor's papers described the property line running along the creek's western bank, a full quarter-mile from where her father's original survey, and every practical year of her own memory, placed it. The difference meant considerably more than a few acres of grazing land. It meant control of the only reliable dry season crossing in that stretch of the valley. Samuel, overhearing her working through the papers by lamplight, mentioned offhandedly that he'd watched Victor's survey men replace one of the old boundary markers near the creek some weeks back, driving a new iron stake into ground that had held a weathered wooden one for as long as he could remember. Clara set down her pen very slowly and asked him to describe exactly what he'd seen. The following morning, she and Elias walked the creek line together and found the new marker exactly where Samuel had described it, driven a quarter-mile west of where the old wooden post's rotted stump still showed faintly in the grass. Elias crouched beside the stump a long moment, his jaw working the particular way a man's jaw works when he is holding back something considerably larger than the moment strictly requires. "This isn't a mistake," Clara said. "Somebody moved that marker on purpose, to make the transfer papers match a boundary that was never real." "No," Elias agreed. "It isn't a mistake." Clara turned to look at him fully, the accumulated weight of 5 weeks of small, unexplained things finally settling into a shape she could no longer ignore. "You know exactly what this means," she said. And you knew before I found it. I want to know how." Elias was quiet a long moment, the particular quiet of a man deciding at last that the time for careful silence had run out. "Because the water rights this marker is meant to steal belong to me," he said finally, "have belonged to my family for 11 years. "Who are you?" Clara said, though some part of her had already begun assembling the answer from every small oddity of the past 5 weeks. "Elias Nathaniel Rourke," he said plainly. "I own the Rourke Cattle Company, the freight depot, most of the grazing leases in this valley, and, as it happens, the mortgage Victor Shaw has been using to threaten you." Clara took a step back without deciding to, the ground beneath 5 weeks of growing trust shifting in a way that left her genuinely unsteady. "You've owned my mortgage this whole time," she said. "You let me refuse your money like I was protecting some kind of pride, when you could have simply canceled the debt with a signature." "I could have," Elias said. "Wasn't trying to trick you into anything, Clara. I came into this valley quiet because my brother died managing it 8 months back, and I needed to understand how it was actually being run before I made decisions that would affect every family in it, including yours. You could have told me," she said. "Every evening at that table, every time you let me think you were nothing more than a drifting hand." "Every word I said to you was true," Elias said. "I simply didn't say all of it. That's not the same as lying, though I understand why it feels that way to you right now." Clara did not answer him. She turned and walked back toward the stage house alone, needing distance more than she needed further explanation, and Elias let her go without following, understanding that some wounds require space before they can properly be tended. She kept her distance through the following days, polite and businesslike whenever their paths crossed, the particular careful courtesy of a woman protecting herself from a hurt she had not yet finished feeling. Samuel, confused by the sudden coolness, asked her plainly one evening whether she was angry at Elias, and Clara told him, honestly, that she was still deciding. She spent those days turning the whole 5 weeks over in her mind, testing each small kindness against the knowledge that he had possessed the power to end her troubles at any moment, and chosen instead to let her carry them. She could not decide, some nights, whether that restraint had been respect or simply another kind of quiet control, and the uncertainty itself became its own particular ache. Elias did not press her during those days, keeping his own distance with a patience that Clara noticed even through her anger, working the Rourke properties without once riding past the stage house uninvited. Samuel mentioned one afternoon that he'd seen Elias in town looking considerably more tired than usual, and Clara found she could not fully enjoy hearing it. Victor Shaw, sensing weakness in the sudden distance between them, arrived 3 days later with a final notice. The full balance due within the week or the stage house would revert to his company entirely. Clara read the notice twice at her kitchen table, alone, and understood that whatever her feelings toward Elias, she could not afford the luxury of prolonged anger while Victor's scheme threatened not only her but every family whose land bordered that same creek. She rode out to the Rourke ranch herself the following morning, brass key still in her coat pocket out of habit rather than purpose, and found Elias exactly where a hand had told her he'd be, mending fence in the near pasture. "I'm still angry," she said, before he could speak first. "I know," Elias said. "You've every right to be." "But I need your help regardless," Clara said, "because Victor isn't only after my stage house. He's after that creek crossing, and if he gets it, every family along this valley loses their dry season road within the year, whether or not I personally hold on to my building." "I could simply cancel your mortgage this afternoon," Elias said quietly. "Wouldn't take Victor's scheme off the whole valley's back," Clara said. "Would only save me, and I won't be saved at the cost of everyone else losing their own crossing to a man who's already proven he'll forge whatever paper he needs to." Something in Elias's expression shifted at that, a particular respect settling into place alongside whatever else he was feeling. "Then tell me what you need," he said, "because I expect you've already got the shape of a plan I haven't thought of yet." Clara laid it out plainly, standing there in the pasture with the fence half-mended between them. She had her own decade of stage records showing the true boundary and every dry season closure the old crossing had ever required, testimony from freight drivers like Amos Kellerman who'd used that crossing for years, the moved marker itself as physical evidence, and, if Elias could obtain it, The railroad's actual survey schedule proving Victor's timeline had been designed to beat the public announcement. "You provide the authority and the original deed," she said. "I'll provide the pattern that proves what he's actually done, because papers alone won't convince this valley the way a plain accounting of the truth will." Elias agreed without hesitation, understanding, plainly, that her plan carried a clarity his own scattered instincts toward simply overpowering Victor with money had lacked. Over the following days, they worked the case together with a careful thoroughness that slowly, without either of them remarking on it directly, began rebuilding the trust her anger had temporarily broken. They spent long evenings at the stagehouse kitchen table, ledgers and survey maps spread between them, Samuel often falling asleep in the corner chair while they worked past his bedtime without either of them noticing the hour. Clara found in that shared labor something considerably more valuable than an apology, the steady daily proof of a man who listened to her judgment and built his own actions around it, rather than simply directing her toward his. She noticed, too, that he never once tried to take credit for insights that were plainly her own, correcting Amos Kellerman gently one evening when the driver mistakenly attributed the boundary discovery to Elias rather than to Clara's careful records. It was a small thing, and she noticed it anyway, filing it away alongside every other small proof of a character she was slowly, carefully, allowing herself to trust again. Amos Kellerman gave his account willingly, and two other drivers besides, each confirming the same true boundary Clara's records had always shown. Otis Bragg, no longer needing to catch his own slip of the tongue, spoke plainly now of Mr. Rourke and what he knew of the water rights Victor's company had been quietly trying to claim for months. The railroad survey schedule, once Elias's lawyer in Cheyenne produced it, confirmed exactly what Clara had suspected, a public announcement scheduled for 6 weeks out, timed precisely so Victor's forced sales could complete before land values across the valley properly reflected what was coming. It was, laid out plainly, not simply a mortgage dispute, but a calculated scheme to strip an entire valley of its water access before anyone understood what was actually at stake. The rescheduled auction, forced by Victor's own final notice, drew nearly the whole valley to the stagehouse yard. And it was there, 5 weeks after Elias had first walked up that same dusty road asking for a meal, that Clara found herself once again standing beside Samuel with the brass key pressed into her palm. Victor mounted his crate with the same confident smile, reading the same practiced terms, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his scheme had already shifted. "This is a legal sale," Victor said again, echoing his own words from that frozen opening moment, and this time it was Clara who stepped forward first. "Is it?" she said, loud enough for the whole gathered yard to hear. "The boundary your transfer papers describe was moved 3 weeks ago," Clara said, holding up the old survey beside the new one for the crowd to compare plainly with their own eyes. "Driven a quarter-mile west of where it stood for 30 years, to steal a creek crossing that belongs, by every honest record this valley has ever kept, to the Rourke family." Victor's composure cracked visibly, his eyes finding Elias in the crowd with a dawning understanding that arrived several weeks too late to help him. "Rourke," he said, the name landing in the silent yard like a stone dropped into still water. "Elias Nathaniel Rourke," Elias said, stepping forward at last, his voice carrying the same calm certainty it had carried at the first auction. "You've spent months trying to seize water rights that were never yours to claim, using forged boundary markers and a mortgage transfer your own bank representative can't properly account for." Amos Kellerman spoke next, plain and unhurried, confirming before the whole gathered valley exactly which crossing he and every driver on that road had used for a decade. Otis Bragg followed, and then 2 more drivers besides, until the accumulated weight of testimony left Victor with nowhere honest left to stand. Otis spoke last among the drivers, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had spent months half-guessing at a truth he had not felt free to say aloud. "Known this was Rourke water since before some of you were old enough to ride a horse," he said plainly to the gathered crowd, "and I'll not apologize for holding my tongue about a man's business until he was ready to speak it himself." The county representative present for the auction, having heard enough to postpone any sale entirely pending formal review, closed his ledger and announced the proceedings suspended until the matter could be properly investigated. Victor Shaw left Sagebrush Valley within the month, his scheme unraveled publicly and completely, and the families along that creek kept their water and their crossings secured by records and testimony, rather than by any single man's fortune alone. Word of the reversal traveled through the valley faster than any single rider could have carried it, the particular way news moves through a place where everyone's livelihood depends on everyone else's honesty. By week's end, families Clara had never formally met were stopping by the stage house simply to thank her, understanding plainly that her stubborn insistence on proof rather than a quiet private rescue had protected considerably more than her own building alone. Elias worked in the weeks that followed to formalize fair leases across the valley. Transparent agreements he discussed openly with every family, rather than dictating from a distance the way his brother's absent management style had allowed men like Victor room to operate in the first place. He made no announcement of grand generosity, no public distribution of wealth, only steady, visible fairness applied consistently to people who had spent months uncertain whether the ground beneath them belonged to them at all. He held meetings at the freight depot most Saturdays, answering questions plainly and adjusting terms when families raised legitimate concerns, the particular ordinary diligence of a man determined to manage what he'd inherited properly, rather than simply profitably. Otis Bragg took to saying, around town, that the valley hadn't seen a Rourke work this closely with ordinary families since old man Rourke himself had first settled the land 2 generations back. Clara kept the stage house, her name remaining on the deed exactly as her father had left it, the mortgage properly canceled rather than transferred into anyone else's generous keeping. Elias offered nothing that resembled purchasing her independence, understanding by then exactly how much that independence had cost her to build and protect. It was evening, weeks later, when he found her on the stage house porch, the same porch step he'd repaired that first afternoon, still holding solid beneath them both. She held the brass key loosely in her hand, turning it over the way she often did when her thoughts had wandered somewhere private. "I never needed you to own everything," Clara said, watching the last light settle gold across the valley. "I valued you when I thought you had nothing but worn boots and a willingness to split my woodpile without being asked twice." "I know," Elias said quietly. "That's precisely why I could finally tell you the rest of it, once the danger had passed. You'd already decided what you thought of me before you ever knew what I owned, and that's worth more than anything a deed could prove. The only thing I ever hoped to earn," Elias said quietly, "was the right to stay beside you, whether you'd learned what I owned or not." Clara looked at him a long moment, the accumulated weight of 5 hard weeks finally settling into something considerably lighter than anger. She reached over and pressed the brass key briefly into his open palm, not surrendering it but simply letting him hold what mattered most to her for a moment, the particular trust of a woman who had decided, at last, that some things were worth sharing plainly. He closed his hand around it gently and handed it back to her just as gently, understanding exactly what the gesture had asked of him and exactly what it meant that she'd offered it at all. "Keep it," he said. "It's yours. Always was and always will be. Same as this stage house and everything you built here while nobody else was watching closely enough to notice." Clara smiled, the particular smile that costs a person something before it settles into something easy and true, and slipped the key back into her coat pocket where it had rested every day since her father first taught her to lock that door herself. Samuel called to them both from the yard, holding up the model wagon Elias had helped him mend, its wheels turning true and steady across the packed earth exactly as promised. Clara took Elias's offered hand and walked down the porch steps toward the boy and the wagon and the whole quiet, ordinary evening, waiting for all 3 of them together.